Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review Candyman 2021. So, immediately, if people are to finally go into this film or to have seen this film, here is a question that a lot of people will probably ask. A lot of people will probably ask me, should I see the original Candyman before going into this? And so I would say that this movie can be its own thing, but also has a lot of ties to the original Candyman movies. So you can create your way of seeing this, of it just being its own thing, and you'll be fine with that. Or you can decide to go ahead and watch the original and then come back and watch the newer variation of this film, which does tie in uh, the very first film frequently enough to where you'll just be like, okay, I don't think I need to exactly watch the first. So it gives you that kind of like, it gives you that choice. Because technically, this can be a sequel to the original, but it also can still, you know what I mean? It's just, uh, like, you can write your own way of either, like, more than likely it's easy just to go through both of these films, and for any little details that you want to know more about, then you got the first film, you got the original film. So now comparing the two, how do I feel about this Candyman 2021, and how do I feel about the original? Well, I will honestly say that I think I do like the original a little bit more. I just like the story a little bit more. But um, because this movie has this kind of slow build to it, but though, there is some creative things that they do with this movie that has really good payouts eventually once we get further and further and further on into the film. A lot of people will be asking, like, well, hey, is this like a gross out movie? Does it go too far? Like, for me, I'm just like, you know what? Like, I think it kind of goes on an even approach, where it doesn't feel like it's too much of a gore fest. I don't feel there, like, yeah, you do have the parts where eventually Anthony is kind of like, uh, eventually, like, he has this kind of like skin infectional thing going on, and eventually Anthony gets at some points where it kind of is like, that's a little gross. But as far as the kills goes, like, the kills are like fairly simple. There's some stuff that isn't actually seen 100% on camera, and a lot of times you're seeing a certain camera angle where you're seeing people being killed, but you're not seeing all the carnage. You're not seeing people completely getting torn apart. You're just seeing something from blah, blah. You're seeing something from a perspective of a person watching this carnage from a safe distance, and whichever. And eventually this movie more and more gets interesting, because eventually it's taken from a person that was to almost have gotten caught or involved or killed by this original Candyman, to eventually have all this lore eventually about this Candyman, to eventually have this guy who is to eventually paint a canvas recreating the whole lore or legend of the Candyman within Anthony McCoy's paintings. So, and there is this almost kind of spot here where I feel like there is some kind of like uh, velvet buzzsaw thing going on here, because Anthony is to eventually make this whole Candyman thing a painting or a project or a thing that eventually will tie into the whole Candyman legend. And then eventually Anthony is to want to expand to have this whole thing just be about this Candyman guy, because it seems like more and more Anthony is becoming famous from this thing. It seems like even his woman, who's to be Brianna, is starting to get famous from this thing, and just like, hey, how about we know about your kind of story, because it seems like you had a very troubled past. So, and I'm talking about Brianna, and so hey, maybe you can get some kind of like popularity off of this thing. So with that said, there was something that I was just like, there's certain kind of shots in this film where I was just so fascinated by. Um, like, there's something very artsy about this film also, where I was just kind of like, brah, freaking vo. You know what? Like, when I was watching this film, like, I just, like, the more that I was, like, really, like, coming back after watching this film, I was like, man, this movie is slow, but you know what? Like, there's something about the style of this film. There's something about the shots of this film, that I really was eventually just now after watching it just won by. So for those of you on the fence with this movie, how do I feel about this film? Well, kind of the whole like the slow to the crawl build kind of this movie was one where I was kind of like, yeah, like, and I know a lot of people will say that about the original one too, that it was kind of a slow build, but there's just a story consistently there from minute to minute that I just continue to find fascinating. Where eventually there is some dead spots in this movie where it's just like, okay, let's get to the point, let's get to the build. Um, but yeah, so I would say that this is a solid, like almost going into a pretty solid good movie. Uh, Almost going into great territory. Just like, well, no, I would say that that's like, to be safe, I would say that this is a solid good movie, just because of its artistic approach, and like it has it where you don't have to go into the original Candyman and still understand the lore of it all. It's kind of like the It remake, where like it has its own kind of thing, but it's also to just like, hey, but remember that original? Especially towards the very end of the film, where it's to just give us that one scene to just be like, ah, like, yeah, freaking, yeah, that was great. The very last thing that you see before credits was just like, oh, such a good payout. That was so good. That felt so good. And so we'll just kind of see where eventually sequel or anything like that will lead us. So, where can you go to watch this film before I get into spoilers? So, I have an app that I've been using fairly reliably, and so I got to watch Candyman via there for absolutely free. I've been using this app called Fox HD Movies. If you search through Google Play, you should be able to find this fairly easy, I hope. And you could watch either the more current 2021 Candyman, or you can even watch the other older Candyman movie for absolutely free. And because I think right now it's like a $20 some odd fee anywhere else. But hey, like, do whatever you want with your money. If you just want to just go and buy this somewhere that eventually you can watch it as much as you want to, then go ahead and do that. If there's some streaming service thing somewhere that is allowing you to just keep this movie or whichever, then go ahead. Uh, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do with their film or their money or whatever. So with that said, let's get into spoilers about this one. Uh, really, I'm going to talk about the first original movie when there's scenes from here that are to relate to the original film. I'm not going to go and talk about every little bit of piece, whatever, of the original film, because then I could go back and just review the other film, which I think I did at some point, but I don't think it ever came back here. I never went and because I reviewed this film, but like the copy in whatever version of which I had never came here, um, which I don't believe it did. Let me pause here for a second to double check. No, oh well. If eventually it seems like the uh, any of these Candymans seem to go well, maybe I'll go back and I'll re-review the original Candyman film, just because like there's certain scenes in there where like I like the dark grittiness or kind of like the hopelessness at some points where it just seems like the place in which that these people were to live in the original one were just a very dangerous place that anybody could just kind of eventually get like stabbed by anybody. That was the kind of the dangerous kind of thing of the original film. So, but anyway, so let's go on here. So the kind of the real beginning of this movie is to take place in 1977. So there is to be this kid who goes off to his apartment complex to go to uh, this of course laundry room to just kind of do his clothes. And so while this kid is to go and do this laundry, all of a sudden he ends up finding this little piece of candy and he ends up picking it up. He ends up picking it up to all of a sudden have this huge hole in this wall. And so this guy comes out of said wall with his hook for a hand. And so this kid, before entering this laundromat, all of a sudden has these two police officers that has this paper of, have you seen this man? Call this number, blah, 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 blah. So the kid is to eventually scream bloody murder because this guy is scary. And so all of a sudden the police officers rush into uh, this room that the Candyman is in, and then the kid is to uh, go off to the side, and so like the police officers are trying to take care of this Candyman guy. So eventually that pushes us on to present day, and so we end up having a guy named Troy with his boyfriend going off to like this is to have Troy's boyfriend meet his sister. And so they have this kind of like get together thing with both Anthony and Brianna and Troy and his boyfriend, which I think is Grady, I believe. So they all of a sudden have this get together, and so all of a sudden we end up having Troy telling us this story. And eventually, like, it's done from the style of this kind of little marionette or kind of just like old-fashioned papered cutout style. That kind of just feels like an old-fashioned thing to do. Like, it kind of feels like those old-fashioned puppet shows were eventually like, or shadow shows, when like people just didn't really have much money, and but they still wanted entertainment, and all of a sudden they just went with this. So Troy is to mention the story about the original Candyman, on how there was this reporter, and eventually she went into this bad neighborhood, and eventually all of a sudden this lore was to start to spread around about Candyman, and so eventually at some point, uh, there was to be this heart of this town, where all of a sudden like everything was to have this one big huge fire going on, and a kid was to be sacrificed in this fire to Candyman, and eventually the woman was to end up saving this kid from this fire to eventually sacrifice herself to Candyman. And so eventually that is what happens really with the story. But towards the real end of it, we really just have the female woman eventually becoming Candyman at the end of it, really. Just, but it seems that we end up really just forgetting all that, and just kind of just being like, oh no, like we're just gonna consistently say uh, like that, that the Candyman is always kind of the same guy, and so Anthony is to mention, like, that is a very interesting story. And so Troy, before he leaves this get together, is to tell Anthony that, hey man, like, it's great that you're kind of like taking your time trying to figure out what to paint and all, but like, hey man, you need to stop dropping the weights, and you need to start picking up the paintbrush. So, and I know I'm gonna paraphrase this a lot, or I'm gonna like try to like do this in like a roundabout way to kind of get it done, because there's a lot of things to also like go into this thing eventually once we get to the bigger parts here. So Anthony eventually is to play around with Bianca and just be like, hey, how about we go and we summon Candyman? How about we eventually go and look into the mirror or reflective surface and eventually say Candyman 5 times? So Anthony goes on and continues to say it and say it and say it and say it. So Bianca's like, hey man, don't do that. Like, don't do that kind of stuff. So, but Anthony just continues to say it. So eventually what ends up happening is that Anthony needs to come up with some kind of thing to put into this art show. And so Anthony's like, well, yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to do a piece about a certain part of town. And of course, the part of town was to be the whole story about Candyman. And so eventually Anthony is to go to this part of town and eventually just start clipping pictures and eventually try to find or figure out like much more background about this. Eventually we have Anthony finding out that this reporter is actually was a legitimate person. And so eventually Anthony finds recordings or tape recordings of this reporter, and so eventually he starts listening to her recordings of the original woman from the Candyman films. So Anthony eventually is to go and see some kind of police officers driving by, and all of a sudden he ends up bumping into this William Burke guy, who is to just kind of mention about like how like the police are kind of making their way through this part of town. And so Anthony goes and is like, well, hey, like thanks for like kind of giving me the heads up about what they're doing here. So all of a sudden they both introduce themselves, and this guy introduces himself as William Burke. So eventually we go to this laundromat, and so we end up finding out that this William Burke seems to know the whole lore about this Candyman. And so William Burke is to also mention the real reason why he knows every bit of lore about this is because he himself was that kid that was to have gotten scared by uh, the whole Candyman situation, and eventually that the police arrived and supposedly took care of him, but there is no real true guarantee to that. So William has mentioned that this story of this character has gone on for numerous years, certain kind of decades, certain kind of times. And so the very last variation of this character was to be a guy who was to be a painter that eventually did a bunch of portraits. And we find out that this variation of this character all of a sudden fell in love with the daughter of the guy that he was painting this portrait of. And so it seemed that because I guess maybe they were maybe a different shade of skin color, it seemed that they were not welcome to this relationship. And so eventually this Candyman was to be chased after, and probably like a mob was like chasing after him. And so what they ended up doing was they ended up chopping off the guy's hand and putting a hook into this guy's hand, and just kind of forcing him to eventually live the rest of his life without the use of one of his hands, because simply just because about what happened. So eventually we have Anthony, who is to get all this information about this whole lore, legend, whatever. And so what he ends up doing is, at first he ends up going and painting this painting about the lore of this story, or just the let me pause here for a second. All right. Hopefully there's no pausing. There's no more pausing. I apologize. But anyways, so eventually Anthony paints his painting, and he ends up showing it to Brianna. Brianna's like, well, like there's something about it that just kind of feels painful. And Anthony's like, yeah, like it really feels like I'm really feeling something from these paintings. It really feels like I should continue doing something like this. I should continue having this be my theme, because I'm really into this. I'm really feeling this. So all of a sudden, at one point, Anthony is to have a bee inside his place while he's trying to paint, and so all of a sudden, I think the very first thing we have is Anthony getting seemingly stung with this bee, and then all of a sudden his hand is to have this little bump, and then all of a sudden this bump turns into this kind of very like skin rash or irritation, and then all of a sudden we more and more eventually have Anthony, who all of a sudden is to start to have this kind of skin irritation eventually become this like this kind of thing where eventually like skin is almost coming off at some point. And so eventually it gets so bad that Anthony is to kind of lose a little fingernail, so, or like a thing of fingers. So he ends up going to the doctor, and they end up having to perform a surgery for Anthony to be able to seemingly use his hand again. But this infection eventually just continues to spread, like it continues to go onto his neck and everything like that. So, anyways, so, but let's pull back a little bit before we get to that heavy amount of point where this guy is heavily infected with this whole thing and whatever, because that really happens towards really the end, the bulk of the end of the movie. So Anthony eventually goes and does this painting where we have this seemingly mirror, but then Anthony can open up this mirror to have the paintings uh, behind this said mirror. And so Anthony is to go on and like kind of really kind of boast about this painting and how he really feels about it, or how like I guess someone else should feel about it. And we have this one artist critic woman who is to look at this and like, so like you're one of those artists probably that has like a very cheaply rented apartment, so that way you can like try and get as many paintings as you can possibly get out, so that way like you won't have to do much with your life kind of thing. And then this woman kind of walks off, and it's like, God, what a bitch. Like, so we also have Anthony's kind of like other kind of artist people that are kind of making fun of him because of this whole painting. And we have one of the critiquers that is to kind of mention, it's like, well, hey, like, where did you get these paintings from? Like, from some thrift store? Or like, where did you get this idea from? Or where did you get this story from? Like, I think it's really just because they're jealous, or it's really just because, like, they are to kind of just throw this kind of, like, artsy thing that Anthony was to do under the bus for whatever reason. Eventually, so we end up kind of closing this art gallery down, and so we have both Clive and I believe his girlfriend, who is Jerica. And so we have Clive, who's kind of mentioning how like Brianna shouldn't like sleep with somebody and try to sell their art. Like it's just like don't crap where you eat kind of thing. So eventually Clive is to be uh, with this girl, and she's to be like, well, hey, like, what is the thing about this mirror thing anyways? And the guy is like, well, you gotta say Candyman 5 times in the mirror. And she's like, well, alright, then how about I just do that right now? Like, how about we just like figure out if the thing is really true or not? And so the guy is like, well, hey, don't go and do it. Don't do it, because if anything, like I want to uh, go and have sex with you. I always have to spell out. I don't like it, but anyways, so but he's like, well, hey, like maybe you should go do it, because like me going and doing it with a cadaver, like that's on my bucket list. So this girl eventually hooks herself bizarrely onto Clive, and then all of a sudden just starts to consistently speak the words, of course. So eventually Jerica gets to the 5th time and says it, and so all of a sudden we have this girl who has her throat now cut and falls over onto Clive, and he's like, oh my god, is this real? Like, is somebody playing around? And so this girl is bleeding, and so Clive is like, I'm gonna get the out of here, because we end up seeing Candyman in the background, and so he ends up slicing this big projector of some film going on, and so eventually Clive tries to make a break for it, tries to get out to the door, but we end up finding this guy going and having his ankles being sliced, and then he ends up falling to the ground, and he ends up getting dragged back to where eventually he can be killed. And so all of a sudden, the next thing that we end up seeing is, I guess, that Brianna had found these two bodies, and Anthony is to eventually go on and see a news report where they end up talking about his painting and saying his name on TV. And the only thing that he ends up taking from that is like, oh my god, like my name is on TV, like my painting is on TV. And his friends are just like, but people had died in front of your painting. And he's like, oh, well, I guess, like, I guess I didn't think about that. I guess I didn't realize that. So we have the moment where Anthony is to go on to this library and eventually go and check out these recordings from this reporter. And we have this library woman who's like, oh, are you some kind of criminal law or criminal investigating student? So Anthony's to just disappear with the recordings, and so he is to just listen to them. And so he ends up going into this elevator, and all of a sudden, what eventually he is to find is this piece of candy. So he ends up grabbing this piece of candy and unwrapping it, to all of a sudden have his thumb all of a sudden get cut for whatever reason. Because William Burke was to mention that supposedly it seems that there had been this consistent report of razor blades being put in certain pieces of candy. But it really doesn't seem like we all of a sudden find these blades in this candy, but like still it seems to be a candy that cuts people regardless. So all of a sudden we eventually have Anthony, who is starting to get scared via this elevator, to eventually look up on the very top of the elevator to eventually see, staring back at him, a Candyman version of himself. Because Anthony is to eventually see this dropping of blood, because Anthony is to, of course, be bleeding, and so he's starting to drop blood on the floor, and then all of a sudden that blood is starting to hit him in the face, and so Anthony ends up looking up to see a Candyman looking down on him, and so Anthony starts to freak out. So, not really understanding what any of that is. So eventually Anthony, who now has his painting seemingly like clamoring for people wanting to look at it, to where even like Bianca is like people are wanting to know Bianca's story, because evidently Bianca eventually had her story where her father had decided to take his own life by, I guess, jumping off this this part of his home or apartment, wherever he was living. And so Bianca's father was asking this girl, it's like, hey, like, did you know that I could fly? Bianca's like, no, like, how is it that you can fly? And then all of a sudden, her father just jumps off this roof and dies, or jumps off this place that he is in and dies. And so evidently that's the horrifying story of her father, which we kind of barely get a little information about or whatever. So so eventually we go to have Anthony re-talk back with this woman who had mentioned about how people that are starving artists need to just kind of get the cheapest apartments so that way they can kind of just uh, be lazy and do like the least amount of like work to eventually just kind of keep their living or to keep their lives or to keep their uh, their just hustle just down to a minimum. So eventually when this woman is to eventually ask, who I believe is, I want to get this correct. I don't think I will be able to. Um, Finley Stevens might be the curator woman or the kind of the woman that's kind of the high end kind of artist critiquer or whatever. So this woman is to eventually ask Anthony about like the history, like his history, and eventually get everything down. Um, like so that way, if anyone is to eventually sell his paintings, that there's a whole entire history attached to this painting. And so Anthony is to kind of get under this girl's skin and just to kind of uh, harpen back about what she had said to him, where all of a sudden he is to just kind of say the opposite. It's like, well, hey, I thought I was just a guy that is to do like the most minimal work possible to have like an apartment with cheap rent and everything like that, so that we can just keep doing my little hustle that I'm doing, kind of thing. So eventually Anthony is to throw this back at her and is to tell her, hey, uh, because she decided that she wanted to use the facilities and go to the bathroom, Anthony is like, okay, great. Like, that's the best thing to do right now because you can go into a mirrored room and say Candyman 5 times. And, like, I dare you. Go ahead and do that. Like, because, like, he just hates her. He just doesn't like her. And because he just was treated by crap by her. And now she wants to know everything about this. And it's like, good luck. So this girl ends up going into the bathroom, and maybe she does this, maybe she doesn't. And so all of a sudden, Anthony is to eventually look into the mirror. All of a sudden, to start to see on the opposite end of the mirror, there is all of a sudden a number of bees that are to appear kind of smacking against this mirror. And so also Anthony is to be kind of confused because he's seeing this Candyman guy in front of the mirror, but every movement that Anthony is to make, this Candyman person is to copy every bit of this. So at first he was freaked out, but then he was like, okay, what does this mean? Why is it that every time I move, this thing moves? This guy moves. And to where eventually the woman finally gets out of the bathroom, and so Anthony's like, okay, I just need to get out of here. Because eventually he like opens up his like scab, and then eventually decides that uh, eventually he's gonna go to the doctor at some point to get this all checked up. After he ends up going and having this kind of get together where he talks to some of his friends and so on and so forth. So eventually one of Anthony's friends is to eventually get a call finding out that the girl that Anthony was with at that place to kind of dare her to go and say Candyman 5 times in the mirror, evidently uh, this woman had died and her husband had found her in the in the home dead. So and everybody's naturally assuming that that guy did it. But of course, who do you think really did it? It was Candyman all along. So we also had this moment where this young girl was to eventually uh, like go and take the picture of this whole mirror situation, and also like know this or get to know this paper. So eventually she goes off to her school and goes into her bathroom with a bunch of her friends, and so she decides to go and play this game. And so not all the girls go and do it. Some of the girls decide to leave, but there was to be this one girl who heads in the bathroom stall to take a dump. And so all of a sudden the girls go and they do this game. So all of a sudden you now are heavily with the perspective of the girl in the bathroom stall, because all of a sudden you just start to see these girls getting dragged around all over the place, and like blood is being splattered all over the floor, and you just start to see these girls screaming, crying, and begging for their lives and whatever. And eventually at some point you have one girl who drops her makeup bag in her little makeup kind of thing with a mirror on it, to see the Candyman is kind of dragging these women around and slicing them up. So this kind of has at some point some kind of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like the remake one, where a lot of times you don't see all the carnage, but eventually you get little pieces of it. But I think they really wanted to just kind of hold back and not make this such a gruesome movie, but like they also wanted to kind of leave some stuff to the imagination, I guess. So going on further into this film, so eventually we have where Anthony is really just starting to realize more and more that he had made a mistake, that he had kind of opened up this hornet's nest and he didn't realize what he was doing. That eventually these paintings are just spreading the legend of Candyman. And so really Anthony is just like, oh my god, this was a huge mistake. Like, I'm putting so many people's lives at risk and I didn't realize this. Like, I just thought I would make these paintings. And we have really just Anthony just he just got so stuck on this that he didn't realize what the damage he was causing. So all of a sudden, eventually Brianna is to come home to see all the paintings that Anthony had put together, and Anthony's like, no, don't look at all these paintings, like don't see them, don't look at them, don't whatever. And eventually Brianna is like, seriously, like, is this all just because of this legend? Because at some points we had both Anthony and we had Brianna that is to consistently just have nightmares, but Brianna decides to just go like, you know what, like let's put this legend to rest right now. And so Brianna starts saying the guy's name, and we have Anthony who ends up breaking the mirror of which that Brianna was looking at. And so Brianna decides to go and live with her brother for a while, to just eventually have Anthony kind of cool things down, or eventually maybe have Anthony realize himself that he has lost his freaking mind and maybe he needs to go and seek help. So, I'm trying to think now if there's anything that I don't think I haven't covered yet. Because I think there might have been a spot here or there that I might have forgot about. But that's bound to happen. Check out the movie if that's what you really want to do. But I think we're okay for the most point. There might have been a spot that I forgot about. but hopefully I'll probably remember it while I'm talking more about this film. So, uh, so eventually we have Brianna who is hanging out with Troy, and so eventually Brianna is to go back to the apartment where Anthony is not there and collect some of Brianna's things. So eventually what ends up happening is that Brianna is to eventually head to this laundromat where eventually we end up finding out that William himself had honestly wanted to orchestrate this whole Candyman situation because of how bad and how awful this city really is, and how he thought that re-ushering out the Candyman and his whole story was to eventually kind of like clean up this town, or eventually kind of correct things, which William is just insane. So eventually we have Brianna who is to uh, kind of forced to go and see William himself go and chop off Anthony's hand and go and give him a hook and like really just put a belt on Anthony's hand so he won't bleed out. So that way they can keep the lore of this character. Now I also want to get to this one moment also. So we end up finding out that Anthony from the original Candyman movie was the baby that was to be sacrificed to Candyman. And so there's a whole like prodigy about all this, that the one kid that was to almost get sacrificed to eventually, I guess, be the Candyman is eventually going to be the Candyman regardless. So it's either way, like Anthony was destined to become the Candyman because he was to be the kid in the fire to almost be sacrificed, and his mother had lied to him about where he had been born, because he eventually ended up like finding the records when he was to go to the hospital to find out that he was to have been born in a different spot than what his mother had told him. So eventually Anthony had gone and talked to his mother, and so his mother had brought up this whole Candyman story, and how like he was to have been the kid to be sacrificed to the Candyman, but eventually the reporter eventually just went on to like trade places with him, and so the mother got to keep her baby, which eventually was Anthony. So I was like, okay, this is really interesting, like to me. I don't know about everyone else. So back to Anthony, who is now seemingly a shell of his former self. He is very just like the lights are on, but no one's home kind of thing with Anthony all of a sudden now, where it doesn't really seem that Anthony has much of any kind of control. It seems like something else is controlling him. And we end up finding out by the very end of this that the thing that actually is really controlling him is the spirit of the other Candyman, and that becomes very evident by the original Candyman's face upon Anthony's kind of mentioning to spread the word to Brianna about Candyman before she loses her freaking mind. So Anthony eventually goes and is to, of course, kill William. And then eventually, the police are to arrive at this laundromat, uh, and eventually go and shoot Anthony. And so Brianna is to be put in this cop car, and so this cop is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, you can have two options of how you want to go and do this. You can either be an accomplice, and we'll put you away for a really good long time, or we can go another route with this. And so Brianna, feeling like there's no real hope or there's no real way out of this, Brianna is like, well, hey, like, I'll tell you what option I want as long as I can go and I can look into this mirror and tell you what the option is. And so the cop is like, okay, whatever you want. So Brianna is to all of a sudden say Candyman, of course, 5 times, and the cop is like, what? Like, why are you saying Candyman? What are you saying Candyman for? So all of a sudden the girl ends up saying this 5 times, and so Anthony ends up coming back from the grave to all of a sudden slice and dice every single one of these cops with his hook. They're firing bullets into him, it's doing nothing, and so Anthony kills every single one of these cops. Eventually we have the one cop who is in Brianna's car who ends up getting out of his car and tries to run off to also get killed also. And so Brianna ends up getting out of her car and she ends up seeing Anthony or Candyman killing another person to eventually see Anthony's face completely change to be of course, a face of the original Candyman that seems to have not aged from the original film, which I'm like, yeah, freaking like giving us like a remembrance of the original film. And so really the very last thing that we end up seeing at the end of this movie is that the Candyman is telling Brianna to spread the word about this whole story. And so she's like, okay, I will. Uh, so really that's how this movie is to end, for me, really. And so I thought that this was a really enjoyable piece, to eventually reflect on the original, but also look at this new kind of style, this new kind of approach. I hope that eventually I covered everything, but I'm sure there might be a scene or two that I might slip or trip about. So there might be some details lost through this review. So hopefully people will eventually go easy on me. If there's some part that I missed somewhere, it's bound to happen. Um, but yeah, so I enjoy this movie. But yeah, I think I'm gonna get out of here because I think I covered everything. Um, there was probably some stuff about the original movie that I didn't go further in depth about because I'm like, just watch the original film, or just watch this movie. Because eventually you'll get more details, especially if you watch the original film, uh, and then watch this one. Because I might just would say that that might be a better thing to watch both. Because it feels this feels like a sequel, but then again, like you don't absolutely have to go out of your way to watch both because they explain it. And so I felt like I kind of explained it. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.